You have 4 stacks of paper. In the first stack, government documents describe a vast, years-long effort by the People's Republic of China to acquire data tied to hundreds of millions of American voter records. Records, not necessarily unique people. The documents show Chinese analysts examining pieces of that data alongside U.S. voter registration records. In the second stack, you have internal FBI and Michigan State Police files describing a multi-year investigation into a registration organization that submitted a large volume of applications in the Muskegon area, a subset of which investigators later flagged as likely fabricated. Former workers for that organization told investigators they were instructed to forge signatures and fabricate forms. Separately, in that same archive, a woman in Southfield told the FBI she'd declined an in-person registration attempt, was later listed as registered anyway, and received what she believed was an absentee ballot which she'd destroyed herself. The record does not establish that her case was connected to the Muskegon organization or that any fraudulent ballot from it was cast or counted. In the third stack, a single, raw FBI intelligence report out of Albany, New York, later recalled by the agency, alleges a plot by a Chinese company to use fake driver's licenses to generate fraudulent mail-in ballots for the 2020 election. And in the fourth stack, emails among senior U.S. intelligence officials argue over how to present intelligence on China's activities, with one official claiming a report headed for the president was being deliberately massaged to downplay the threat. These 4 stacks look like they should connect, like one story. But do they? The White House says yes. A massive, foreign-backed fraud operation detected by frontline investigators buried by the deep state. Today, we test that claim. This is a symposium, not to tell you what to believe, but to build a framework for thinking about evidence. I've brought back 3 of our sharpest minds, each with a different definition of proof. Stan is our expert on election administration, the machinery of democracy, from registration to the final canvas.
Glad to be here.
Marcus is a systems engineer who specializes in data integrity and network security. He follows the bits and the code.
Hello, David. And James is a former career intelligence officer who spent decades on foreign threats. He reads the space between the lines.
Good to be back. We'll put every major claim from this release on what I call the 8-rung ladder of evidence. Rung 1 is an anecdote or a rumor. Rung 8 is proof that an event happened and by itself changed the final outcome of an election. Between those poles, evidence has to mature. Raw reporting gains corroboration. An anomaly gets a plausible cause. A suspected exploit is confirmed, and its impact is measured. Before we look at the documents, let's define our terms, starting with trust. Stan, where does proof begin for you?
Proof is a completed process, a closed loop, a voter eligible and registered, a ballot requested, sent, received, verified, tabulated, a canvass reconciling voters who voted with ballots counted. That's the successful completion of the chain, documented and audited at every step. When a link breaks, the process is designed to catch it, document it, cure it, or set it aside. My trust begins with the auditable, legally mandated procedure, not a person or a machine. Claim a fraudulent vote was counted, and you need to show me where the procedure failed. If you can't, you have an allegation, not proof.
Marcus, same world, different lens. What is proof for you?
Proof is a successful exploit, a line of code that, when run, demonstrates a vulnerability and achieves a result. A log file showing unauthorized access. A database query returning altered data. An election system is just an information system. Inputs, processing, outputs. Stan trusts the procedure. I don't trust anything that hasn't been independently verified. Calling a system air-gapped or certified states intended policy, not proof of anything. Proof is discovering whether reality matches that policy. Trust begins with adversarial testing. Can I break it? If I can, it's broken. If I can't, it's provisionally secure until someone smarter tries. A claim of a hacked election requires the method and evidence of its execution in the logs. Without that, you have a theory about a vulnerability, not proof of an attack. James, your adversaries are actively trying to deceive you. Where does that leave you on proof and trust?
The inverse of both of them. In intelligence, you can't wait for the audited report or the log file, because by the time you have it, the damage is done. Proof is a high-confidence, assessed judgment built on multiple, independently corroborated sources. You rarely have certainty, only degrees of confidence. And trust is a liability. My job starts from the assumption that the adversary is capable, has intent, and is actively working every vulnerability. You mount a defense before you have evidence of an attack, then work backward and look for reasons to lower your confidence. A sophisticated foreign power actively trying to undermine the United States is already a threat. Waiting for Marcus's log file means you've already failed.
That's the problem, James. Assume the attack already succeeded and you poison the whole well. Officials and voters alike have to trust the process absent evidence of failure. Assume failure as a posture, and you're doing the adversary's work for them, destroying confidence before a vote is cast. Evidence of integrity builds public trust. Universal suspicion consumes it.
And it isn't built on willful blindness either. Procedures being in place means nothing if a nation-state is subverting them in ways those procedures aren't designed to detect. You're looking for a single clerk who falsified one entry. I'm looking for a foreign intelligence service capable of falsifying entries system-wide, at scale, whenever it chooses. Your definition of integrity is too narrow. It manufactures a false sense of security, which is itself a vulnerability.
You're both talking policy. I'm talking physics. The system either behaved as designed or was acted on by an outside force, and evidence of that force exists in the data. James, your threat assumption is a useful hypothesis. Stan, your faith in procedure is a good baseline. Neither substitutes for forensic evidence. The data can answer whether an outside force changed the system. A known flaw identifies opportunity. Intent identifies a possible actor. A suspicious pattern tells me where to look. Only the forensic trail can establish an intrusion.
That's the frame for today. We have suspicious patterns, claims about intent and capability, documents describing vulnerabilities. Our job is to see whether any of it adds up to a demonstrated intrusion. We'll apply this three-part lens, procedure, system, threat, to climb the ladder for each major claim. Let's begin with what the White House actually released. Let's get to the heart of it. This week, the White House didn't just issue a statement, it executed a coordinated information release. There was a primetime address from the president, a new page on the White House site titled Election Integrity, and 4 archive groupings of declassified documents: voting systems, China and voter data, Michigan, and non-citizen roles. I want to steelman the administration's case first. Taking the speech, the pages streaming, and the source documents together, what's the strongest possible interpretation of the story they're telling?
The strongest case is a multi-layered story of a grave national security failure built on real documents. It begins with a hostile foreign power, the People's Republic of China, engaged in acquiring American data. The release includes a memo listing a dataset of over 200 million voter-related records, alongside separate analytic material describing PRC possession and analysis of U.S. voter registration information. The second layer is a specific plot, a raw FBI intelligence report out of the Albany field office alleging a scheme involving fraudulent driver's licenses tied to a mail ballot operation. The third layer is an allegation of suppression, an email from a senior official stating that a pending item for the president's daily brief was being deliberately massaged to avoid a direct election link. The final layer is the official dissent, The finished intelligence community assessment found no indications that a foreign actor altered voter registration, ballot casting, tabulation, or result reporting, while a minority view assessed that Beijing had taken limited steps to undermine Trump's re-election prospects, mainly through messaging and influence activity. Taken together, that's a capable adversary, a raw fraud allegation, an internal framing fight, and a documented dissent inside the finished product. A serious set of documents, not just rhetoric.
Put together, these disclosures reveal an election system so broken and so vulnerable that no one can possibly defend it. It is not defensible.
And it's not just foreign intelligence. The second pillar is domestic and administratively just as serious. The Michigan Archive documents a multi-year investigation into a third-party registration group. The original 2020 referral flagged applications with matching handwriting, non-existent addresses, and invalid phone numbers. Investigators later sampled 107 of the applications. 91 returned no result in a state database check, and of the 16 that matched real people, only 4 had matching signatures. That's not proof every one of the roughly 8,000 to 10,000 total applications the group submitted was fraudulent. It's a documented suspicious subset within a much larger total volume. Witness interviews add weight to that subset. Multiple people describe being paid by volume, inventing information, and forging signatures on fabricated forms. A separate complaint out of Southfield involves a woman who says she declined an in-person registration attempt and later found herself listed as registered and received what she believed was an absentee ballot, which she destroyed herself. The record doesn't establish who submitted that registration or tie it to the Muskegon operation. It's a data point, not a confirmed link. What the record does show is delay, limited early prosecutorial authority, a declination, and agents on record saying they didn't want to close the file. The White House is forcing a public accounting of a registration pipeline documented as compromised in a meaningful subset of cases, regardless of whether every thread ties together.
Stan's point about Michigan is the ground-level example of the systemic problem the Voting Systems Archive raises at a higher altitude. That archive compiles years of documented vulnerability findings in electronic voting and tabulation equipment, including coordinated disclosures like the ImageCast X advisories from CISA and the Election Assistance Commission. The Michigan case supplies the ground-level illustration. The Voting Systems Archive supplies the higher altitude pattern. Set the documented foreign interest, the Michigan registration failures, and the persistence of known system vulnerabilities side by side, and the conclusion isn't necessarily that any specific election was altered, but that the infrastructure protecting elections has been treated with less urgency than the threat picture warrants.
So that's the Steelman. Documented foreign data collection, an internal framing fight paired with a raw and later recalled fraud allegation, a Michigan pipeline with a real suspicious subset, and a persistent vulnerability record. James, what's missing to take the intelligence strand from espionage and bureaucratic disagreement to a proven election-altering conspiracy?
The connective tissue. The release shows PRC-linked collection and analysis of American data, which is what intelligence services do. It shows one raw intelligence report alleging a vote fraud plot, a report the FBI later recalled and did not reissue. And it shows a genuine internal dispute over how the China finding was framed for the president. The finished assessment includes the minority analytic view. What's missing is anything connecting the data collection to a single fraudulent ballot being cast and counted. The framing dispute shows people arguing about how to characterize an assessment. It doesn't show the underlying evidence was stronger than what the finished product concluded. Moving from espionage and bureaucratic friction to proven electoral fraud requires a corroborated report that survived scrutiny and forensic evidence tying data collection to an actual vote. That chasm isn't bridged here.
Stan, you laid out a real suspicious subset within the Michigan applications, but also a Southfield case that isn't confirmed to connect to that operation at all. Doesn't that separation cut against treating the release as one coherent proof of a corrupted outcome?
It does, and it's worth being precise about it, rather than letting the two blur together. which is exactly what happens if you read the release uncritically. The Southfield complaint is its own thread, an individual account, unconfirmed as to who filed the registration, not shown to be part of the Muskegon operation. Conflating it with the documented pattern of fabricated applications would overstate the case, but separating them doesn't erase that pattern. A real subset of thousands of applications with fabricated signatures, invented addresses, and pay-by-volume incentives, confirmed by multiple witnesses independently. That's a genuine registration integrity failure, regardless of what happened with any single ballot. The caution here cuts against overclaiming a confirmed fraudulent vote, not against the underlying documented pattern.
That caution applies to the vulnerability record, too. It's a leap to treat a list of potential flaws as proof of systemic corruption, only if you ignore that these particular flaws were documented, disclosed to certifying authorities, and in some cases persisted across cycles rather than being one-off findings. An audit that finds a problem once is routine. The White House's argument at its strongest is that recurrence across cycles without full remediation is itself defining, not that any machine was proven compromised in an actual election. That's a narrower claim than the machines were hacked, and it's the one that documents can actually support.
Across all three threads, the release gives us real documents and genuinely concerning findings. The missing piece is proof that any of them produced an altered vote. The machine files have to meet that same standard.
Marcus, let's turn to the machinery of the election itself. James has laid out a case centered on foreign intelligence, human sources, and alleged cover-ups. But the other half of the White House's argument is more fundamental. It's about the nuts and bolts, the voting machines, the audits, the paper. Steelman that case for us. If you wanted to argue the 2020 election was mechanically compromised, what's your strongest version of it based on these documents?
You'd build it in 3 layers. First, warning. In January 2020, before a single vote was cast, the National Intelligence Council produced a formal assessment of vulnerabilities in U.S. election infrastructure. It documented that named foreign adversaries had real capability to compromise pieces of that infrastructure, and it singled out voter registration databases, poll books, and election websites as especially exposed. That warning came from the intelligence community itself, a catalog of thin spots in the law. Second, a specific and later confirmed flaw. In June 2022, CISA and the Election Assistance Commission both issued advisories about real vulnerabilities in the Dominion Democracy Suite ImageCast X, a ballot marking device used in numerous jurisdictions. CISA's advisory documented the vulnerabilities and called for mitigations. The EAC issued its own component advisory the same day. The two federal bodies treated the coordinated vulnerability disclosure seriously enough to instruct election officials to act on it. Third, foreign intent. There's a CIA note, declassified this year, laying out long-standing intelligence community concern about the intent and capability behind certain voting machine technology, with reporting tied to Venezuela. Put together, the argument is, the IC warned the walls were thin, a real flaw was later found and confirmed in equipment actually used in American elections, and there was intelligence community reporting describing foreign actors as having both the desire and some methods to manipulate voting machines. That's the Steelman. Known exposure, a confirmed flaw, and an adversary on record as wanting to do exactly this kind of thing.
Including electronic voting machines and ballot counting systems, dishonest, almost all. They're vulnerable and they're easily compromised, and people within our government knew that.
Now take it apart.
The whole case turns on whether a documented vulnerability was actually used. The January 2020 NIC assessment warned state and local officials where to harden defenses. It did not report a compromise. A lot of what followed, expanded paper trails, more audits, stricter chain of custody rules, was a response to exactly that kind of warning. The document shows that officials recognized the exposure and acted on it. It doesn't establish a breach. The CISA and EAC material is the same shape of claim. Both advisories establish that a real vulnerability existed in a real deployed machine. Neither establishes that anyone used it. And this is where the physical backstop matters. These are ballot marking devices. They produce a paper ballot. When Georgia ran a full statewide hand audit of the 2020 presidential race, counting the actual paper by hand rather than trusting any machine tally, the manual count upheld the certified result. That's the entire logic of a risk-limiting audit. You don't have to trust the software because you go back to the paper. A machine-level vulnerability that never gets used doesn't survive an audit like that because there's nothing there to find. The Venezuelan note is the weakest leg, and it's important to be precise about what it actually is. It's foreign capability reporting, a picture, with its own internal caveats, of what an adversary might want to do and might historically have tried to do with certain machine technology. It does not establish that any Venezuelan-style manipulation method was ever used on a U.S. system, and by the note's own account, it doesn't even definitively confirm large-scale electronic fraud in the elections it's describing. You cannot move from "we have reporting on foreign intent" to "therefore U.S. machines were exploited" without a piece of evidence that simply isn't in this record. And for what it's worth, the government's own broader 2021 assessment of the 2020 election found no indications that a foreign actor altered voter registrations, ballot casting, tabulation, or reporting. Vulnerability? Confirmed and taken seriously. Exploitation? Undemonstrated.
I'd push back on treating no indications as equivalent to didn't happen. We're talking about a sophisticated adversary whose entire operational goal, if it went down this road, would be to leave no indications. Marcus, you're describing a defender who catches every discrepancy through audits and paper counts, but that only works if the discrepancy is large enough and in the right place to get caught. The NIC's own warning wasn't hypothetical politeness. It said the capability was real. When you combine a documented capability with documented foreign interest in voting machine manipulation, even bounded by caveats, dismissing the possibility because no one has produced a smoking gun, is exactly the failure of imagination the IC was trying to prevent people from making in the first place.
I want to bring in what the people actually running elections found, because that's the part that keeps getting skipped. The Michigan Senate Oversight Committee, Republican-led, reporting in June 2021, went looking at their own state's 2020 election specifically to answer this question. They did not find evidence of widespread or systematic fraud, but they didn't hand out a clean bill of health either. They came back with a list of procedural improvements they thought the state needed to make. That's the honest middle ground here, and it's one both of you are skating past. The system held in the sense that matters most, no proof it changed an outcome, but held and was administered without real gaps are two different findings, and even a committee with every incentive to find fraud didn't claim the second one.
That's a fair correction, and it actually strengthens the point rather than undercutting it. A committee predisposed to find systemic fraud, with full access to its own state's records, didn't find it, but still flagged real administrative weaknesses worth fixing. That's what a functioning, if imperfect, process looks like. Findings that don't flatter either side. It's also consistent with the pattern across the outcome litigation. The major court challenges to the 2020 result did not produce rulings that the requested relief was warranted. The courts weren't presented with proof sufficient to grant it. I'd be careful not to overread that either. Those were specific holdings on specific claims, not a global finding that every fraud allegation anywhere was examined and rejected on the merits. But layered together, the NIC's warning acted on rather than ignored, a real machine flaw confirmed but not shown to be used, a hand audit that matched the certified result, a hostile to friendly state inquiry that still couldn't find systemic fraud, and litigation that didn't produce the evidence needed to change any outcome. The mechanical case doesn't hold up as proof of a stolen election. It holds up as proof of a system with known, documented weaknesses that were, in the specific instances this record covers, checked rather than exploited.
Checked in the instances we can see. That's still not the same as checked everywhere. So we have a dispute between capability and logistics, between what a sophisticated actor could theoretically do and what the decentralized physical nature of this system makes hard to do at scale without leaving evidence. The China archive is where that dispute faces its hardest test. We're going to turn now to the most complex and, frankly, most explosive part of this document release. The trove of intelligence materials tied to the People's Republic of China and the 2020 election. The claims here are foundational to the White House's case. But the documents are dense with the jargon of the intelligence world. James, this is your turf. Unpack it for us. The strongest White House case joins 4 facts into one chain. The PRC is a top-tier adversary. It acquired American data at scale, including voter-related records. An Albany FBI report alleged a specific fake license and mail ballot scheme, and officials fought internally over how Chinese activity should be described to the president and in the final assessment. The minority view was specific. Beijing had taken limited steps to undermine Trump's re-election prospects, principally through messaging and influence activity. Read together, those records suggest a grave threat that was internally flagged and, according to the White House, downplayed. It's a powerful narrative. Now let's test each link. Now let's run it through the actual record. Start with the data. The 200 million figure describes records, not confirmed unique voters. Records can duplicate across sources, and the released material indicates the acquisition paths were mixed rather than one uniform event, without establishing the path for every data set. That is consistent with bulk data acquisition aimed at building a picture of a population for counterintelligence and influence purposes. It's a serious counterintelligence problem in its own right. It is not, by itself, evidence that a ballot was fraudulently requested, cast, or counted. Nothing in this material shows the data being used to actually touch a vote.
China's activities even included an attempt to manufacture illegal ballots for Joe Biden.
Now the Albany IIR. An IIR is raw reporting, explicitly labeled as intelligence that has not been finally evaluated. It functions as an input to a potential investigation, not a conclusion about what happened. The recall notice gave a reason: re-interview the source. Internal records then create a second disputed account. Albany personnel said the re-interview added context supporting the original report, while congressional investigators point to an email saying republication would contradict Director Wray's testimony. Headquarters still did not reissue it. Those records justify scrutiny of the recall, but they do not independently prove the source's allegation. As of the public record, we still lack corroborating evidence of the described plot, batches tied to the scheme, coordinating infrastructure, or a matching surge in fraudulent ballot activity. Then the deliberately massaged email. Read in its own context, it's describing a dispute over framing, wording, and timing inside the PDB drafting process, not a dispute over the underlying facts of Chinese activity. The author believed the China material was being softened and its relevance to Trump's re-election prospects downplayed. Another official may have been applying a narrower standard tied to direct interference with voting infrastructure. The email documents that somebody felt strongly enough about that line to put the word massaged in writing. It doesn't, on its own, tell us which side of that framing argument was right. That same fault line shows up in the final assessment. The intelligence community's majority position found no indication that any foreign actor altered a technical aspect of the 2020 voting process, including registration, casting, tabulation, or reporting. The National Intelligence Officer for Cyber added a formal minority view that Beijing had taken limited steps to undermine Trump's re-election prospects, mainly through social media and official statements, at moderate confidence. Both judgments appear in the public record. The dispute is real, but its scope matters. Influence aimed at one candidate's prospects is broader than direct interference with a vote. The dissent doesn't make the majority wrong, and the majority conclusion doesn't make the dissent baseless or silenced.
The People's Republic of China carried out what is believed to be the largest compromise of election data in history, resulting in China's illicit acquisition of 220 million U.S. voter files.
Worth pausing on what that data actually enables, separate from where it came from. A pile of voter records, even a clean one, isn't itself a vote. Turning it into a fraudulent ballot means clearing several independent hurdles. Requesting an absentee ballot through one of thousands of county-level systems, each with its own rules and its own staff. getting that ballot returned in a form that passes signature verification against a signature on file, which is not a trivial thing to fake at scale, and having it processed without triggering the kind of anomaly, an odd surge from addresses that don't normally vote, that election offices are built to notice. The data is a strong tool for targeting and propaganda. Converting it into counted, fraudulent votes is a much harder mechanical problem, with a lot of independent places for it to fail.
Can I push on the framing dispute for a second? Grant everything James just said, that no vote fraud conspiracy is proven here. The intelligence community still had high confidence knowledge that a major adversary was collecting voter data at scale and running influence operations aimed at the election. The public didn't know that in real time. The public didn't know an official felt strongly enough to write massaged in an email. Separate from whether any vote was actually changed, doesn't the public have a right to know how seriously that threat was being taken internally and how sharply people inside the process disagreed about it? Maybe this isn't a cover-up of fraud, but it can look like a cover-up of how exposed we were.
It suggests somebody wanted to control what reached the president's desk, which is true of most PDB fights that have ever happened. What I can't do is assign one motive to the entire process. The records support competing interpretations, caution about briefing raw reporting as settled fact, and concern that officials wanted to avoid contradicting public testimony. Stan's question about disclosure is therefore legitimate. The finished assessment lets us see the institutional result, a majority judgment beside a named dissent, but the drafting trail does not settle why each earlier decision was made. There was a real fight over how to characterize a real acknowledged threat.
The disagreement is visible. The motives behind the drafting decisions remain contested. Michigan gives us a local test of what institutions do when allegations reach the process.
Stan, let's turn to the Michigan case files, the Muskegon registration drive material involving GBI strategies. I want to rebuild this one strictly from what the released memos themselves say, not from the White House's framing of them. Where does the paper trail start?
It starts with the Muskegon city clerk in October 2020. The original referral memo describes an organization submitting a large volume of voter registration forms. The records point to an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 forms received in total. Out of that volume, the clerk's office flagged a subset as suspicious. Applications listing addresses that didn't exist, phone numbers that weren't valid, signature irregularities, and handwriting that looked repeated across multiple forms. That subset is what got referred to law enforcement. It's important to say plainly, the referral describes a suspicious subset, not a finding that every form in that batch was fraudulent.
So we have a clerk-level catch and a referral. What happened once the FBI picked it up?
The case stayed open for years. The timeline memo shows activity stretching across roughly 4 years, which is unusual for a case this size. At some point, investigators pulled a sample of 107 applications and ran them against state databases. 91 came back with no matching record at all. Of the 16 applications tied to a confirmed real person, only 4 had signatures that matched that person's known signature. Those are the numbers as the memo states them.
What does a no database result actually tell us? Is that proof the person doesn't exist?
No, and the memo itself flags that limitation. A no-hit means the state couldn't locate a matching record. It doesn't automatically mean the application was fabricated from nothing, and it doesn't mean a completed crime occurred or that a vote was ever cast. It's a strong red flag in a sample, not an adjudicated finding.
But look at where that flag sits in the process. The clerk's manual review is the first checkpoint, a human looking at physical paper before anything reaches a poll book. That checkpoint caught the pattern early enough to stop the suspicious batch from simply flowing through unexamined. Then the database check becomes a second checkpoint, further downstream, applied only to a sample. What the 91 of 107 number tells us is that the sampling method was doing real work. It wasn't rubber stamping the batch as fine. Whether it proves fraud in a legal sense is a separate question from whether it functioned as a filter.
Let's get to the witness accounts, because those are the most vivid material in this release. Stan, what do the interview memos actually say?
There are several separate interview memos, and it's worth noting they don't all say the same thing.
The accounts vary by witness. Collectively, they describe people alleging they were paid or incentivized by volume, that some information on forms was made up, that some signatures were forged, and that some forms were fabricated outright. One memo describes a worker account of sitting in a car completing forms. Another describes claims that fraudulent registration extended into other states. These are witness allegations recorded by investigators.
The documents state that some canvassers admitted to FBI agents that they signed voter registration forms in other people's names, submitted fraudulent registration for people who did not exist, and received gift cards tied to their number of applications that they produced.
I want to be careful with the word allegations so we don't undersell it, but also careful not to oversell it. These are people telling FBI agents things under interview conditions. That carries weight, and multiple accounts pointing in a similar direction is not nothing. But allegations recorded in an interview memo are not the same as facts established in a courtroom. Nobody in this record has been convicted of what these witnesses describe. And I'd flag something else. Nothing in these memos, as summarized, ties this operation to direction from a campaign or a political party. The witnesses describe an organization and its incentive structure. That's the boundary of what's actually on the page.
Agreed, and it's a boundary worth holding on to. Now, there's a specific incident in this file that keeps getting cited as the closest thing to a fraudulent ballot. Walk us through it.
This is the Southfield complaint, and it's important to treat it as its own thread. A woman told the FBI she had declined an in-person registration attempt. Later, she received a voter registration card in the mail, and then something she believed was an absentee ballot. She shredded it herself before returning or costing anything. When investigators checked the state database, she did in fact appear as a registered voter.
Does the record connect that incident to the Muskegon operation to GBI?
No. And this is where I'd push back hardest on how this gets characterized publicly. The record doesn't establish who submitted her registration. It doesn't establish that the card or the ballot she received came out of the GBI drive at all. It's a separate Michigan incident that happens to share a state and a rough time frame. Treating it as the payoff of the Muskegon case is exactly the kind of connection the documents themselves don't make.
Which is worth sitting with as a systems observation rather than a narrative one. If her registration did originate from some fraudulent source, then the sequence, card issued, ballot mailed, ballot never cast, means the citizens supply the effective checkpoint. That exposes a possible institutional gap regardless of which operation produced the registration. The file supports a system-level warning. It cannot assign that warning to GBI specifically because it never draws the connection.
Right, and I'd add she said she shredded what she believed was a ballot. That's her account of the object, not a chain of custody confirmation of what it was. I'm not doubting her. I'm saying the documentation is thinner than the anecdote makes it feel.
So we have a Muskegon case with a documented paper trail and a separate Southfield incident that can't be tied to it. What happened to the actual prosecution of the Muskegon matter?
The closer-related memos are candid about friction. There's documentation of limited authority early in the investigation, delays getting the case moved forward, and eventually a declination. Prosecutors chose not to bring charges. There's also a 2021 memo where an agent writes in effect that they don't want the case closed, which reads as real frustration from someone still working it.
Does the file explain why it was declined?
Not fully. What we have is evidence that the declination happened and that agents were frustrated by it. What we don't have is the complete prosecutorial memorandum laying out the legal reasoning, and we don't have anything in this release that proves a political order to bury the case. Those are two different claims, and the documents only support the first one.
That distinction matters to me. Frustrated agents and a declined case is consistent with an ordinary, if disappointing, prosecutorial judgment call, insufficient provable intent per application, resource constraints, whatever it may be. It's also consistent with something worse. The file, as released, doesn't let us pick between those. Saying we don't know is the honest answer, even though it's a less satisfying one than either side wants.
So let's close the loop. Strip away the framing on both sides. Does the public record in this release actually show a GBI-linked application turning into an issued or counted ballot?
No, that's the honest end of the chain. We have a large volume of forms, a suspicious subset flagged by a clerk, a database sample with a very high no-hit rate, witness allegations that vary in detail and were never adjudicated, and a declination years later. Separately, we have one Michigan voter who received something she believed was a ballot and destroyed it herself with no documented link back to GBI. State officials have separately said no one voted as a result of the Muskegon applications. Nowhere in what's been released does the chain actually connect a GBI-originated form to a ballot that was cast and counted.
The public record stops exactly at the point where it would need to go further to prove the thing being claimed about it.
Let's turn to the second major pillar of the White House release, the integrity of the voter rolls themselves. The top-line claim is stunning. An analysis identifying approximately 278,000 non-citizens registered to vote across several states. The entire public evidence for that number is a one-page summary. Marcus, Stan, you've both gone through what that page does and doesn't tell us. Marcus, start with the data. What is this 278,000 figure actually built from?
It's the output of a data matching exercise, and that framing matters from the outset. The summary describes comparing state voter registration lists against other databases and reports two components. Roughly 250,000 of the total are described as possible matches against commercial or other public databases, the kind of consumer and demographic files data brokers assemble. The remaining roughly 28,000 are described as matches tied to data associated with the Department of Homeland Security's SAVE system, which agencies use to verify immigration status for benefits. So the 278,000 is really two different kinds of match, combined into one headline figure, and the larger share by far comes from the less rigorous commercial.
According to the DHS review, state voter rolls and public records, they identified approximately 278,000 non-citizens who are registered to vote in federal elections.
Two different processes, one number.
Right, and that's before you even get to the deeper problem, which is that the one-page release doesn't publish its methodology. It doesn't show the matching rules. Is a match a name alone, name plus address, name plus date of birth? This is what computer scientists call entity resolution, and without the rules, you can't estimate the error rate. Fathers and sons share names. People move. Two unrelated people share a common name and birth year. CBS News examined this same claim and reported that the administration hadn't disclosed a reproducible method and that part of the estimate leans on those commercial databases rather than anything resembling a government-verified list. The states named in the release disputed the conclusions drawn about their roles. The document presents a conclusion without showing the work behind it.
And this is where the data problem becomes an administrative one. Even granting perfect matching, there's a timing problem. Status data of the kind SAVE holds reflects a point in time. Someone recorded as a lawful permanent resident at some earlier date may since have naturalized and become a citizen, legally entitled to register and vote. That naturalization pipeline runs continuously. It doesn't pause for a data pull. A match run against an older snapshot will catch people who were true positives when the underlying record was made and false positives now. Nothing in the one-page summary indicates that flow was accounted for.
Which is why the language has to stay precise. The release implies a straight line. Here are 278,000 illegal voters. What we actually have is a chain, and each link is weaker than the one before it. Level 1, which is all this document provides, is a possible match between two lists. To reach level 2, a confirmed registered non-citizen, an election official has to take that lead and verify, case by case, that it's the same person and that the person isn't a citizen. The release doesn't show that kind of state validation happened at any scale.
Then to get to a ballot cast, you need proof the person actually voted. Then a counted vote, meaning it wasn't a provisional or challenged ballot that got rejected in Canvas. Only after all of that would you even ask about an effect on any outcome. This document sits entirely at the first, most speculative rung. Treating it as a finished count of ineligible voters skips every step in between.
Stan, there was also a court ruling touching the SAVE system itself recently. What did that establish?
A federal district court reviewed a modified version of the SAVE tool being used for this kind of citizenship screening and found serious statutory and privacy defects in how it was built and deployed. The court pointed to real evidence of lawful citizens being flagged and in some cases removed from the rolls based on inaccurate underlying data. I want to be careful here because that ruling doesn't establish that every match anywhere is false, and it doesn't mean non-citizen registration never happens. It happens. It's usually not some organized scheme, it's a motor voter error, someone checking the wrong box while getting a driver's license. Nobody at this table thinks that's acceptable. Legitimate list maintenance done carefully is exactly the tool for catching it. What the court found is that a specific automated screening approach produced real harm to citizens when it was used carelessly. That's not an argument for leaning harder on unverified matches.
I'm not going to defend the one-page summary as a finished product, but you're both still grading this by the standard of a courtroom, and that's not the only lens that matters. Whatever the true rate of false positives turns out to be, a list of 278,000 potential mismatches getting generated at all tells you something about how porous these matching pipelines are. I'm not claiming all 278,000 are proven illegal voters. I'm saying the sheer size of the possible match set is itself a finding about system fragility, independent of how many individual cases resolve.
But James, porous in which direction matters? A commercial database match with no disclosed logic primarily tells us the comparison may be sloppy. It reveals nothing about the voter file until the match is validated. Calling every unverified name match a system failure collapses a data quality problem into a security problem, and those require different fixes.
And my obligation runs the other way. When I get a specific credible allegation about one person, I investigate it. When I get 278,000 unverified batches with no visible methodology, my obligation is to treat that as a starting point for careful casework, not a purge list. The court record shows what happens when that caution slips. Citizens got flagged and removed on bad data. The security risk James is describing is real in the abstract. So is the civic risk of stripping eligible voters off the rolls because a crude match said so. We don't get to worry about only one of those risks.
Then the number itself has done one useful job. It exposed a matching process that the public cannot reproduce. It has not told us how many ineligible voters exist.
James, you've laid out the intelligence process concerns. The White House goes further and argues for a specific outcome, an illegitimate 2020 election. Stan, in a decentralized system run by 50 states, what institutional evidence supports or rebuts that claim?
Start with the basic architecture. The Election Assistance Commission describes mail ballot and duplicate voting controls as layered procedures distributed across multiple checkpoints. Individual fraud can still occur, but a claim that mail voting rests on one unguarded point of trust misdescribes the architecture. Timing gets misread the same way. Look at California's June 2026 primary. Weeks after polls closed, the Secretary of State was still working through outstanding ballots, mail, provisional, conditional, against a published certification calendar. People see a long count and assume something's being hidden, but an extended canvas is what a scheduled, disclosed process looks like on paper. Elapsed time by itself isn't evidence anything went wrong.
Now to the outcome question directly. Georgia conducted a full statewide hand audit of its paper ballots after 2020, and that manual tally upheld the state's certified presidential result. In Michigan, the Senate Oversight Committee, Republican-led, spent months examining the fraud claims and concluded it had found no evidence of widespread or systematic fraud in the state, while still recommending procedural improvements. These were institutional checks outside the White House release, and they matter when the claim is that the certified outcome was wrong.
I want to separate what those two findings actually establish from what people want to read into them. The Georgia audit tells you the hand count matched the certified result in Georgia. It confirms that count was accurate. It isn't a national fraud audit, and it doesn't speak to mail ballot design anywhere else. The Michigan Committee's conclusion is institutional testimony, not a forensic data set. A legislative body examining the claims and reporting what it found. Both are real evidence. Neither is the whole picture by itself.
The same discipline applies to the courts.
Two of the most significant outcome-focused rulings, the Third Circuit's decision in the Pennsylvania campaign litigation and the federal court's ruling in the Wisconsin Elections Commission case, both concluded the plaintiffs hadn't produced proof sufficient to support the relief they were seeking. That's a real finding, and it matters. But it would be wrong to generalize from those two opinions to every lawsuit was tested on the merits. Some other challenges were resolved on standing or procedural grounds without a court ever weighing the underlying fraud evidence. The claim these two rulings support is narrower than the claim people often build on top of them. On outcome scale specifically, this is where Barr's Justice Department matters, and it's worth being precise. Contemporaneous DOJ leadership reported that it had not seen fraud on a scale that could have changed the 2020 outcome. That's a statement about scale, made at the time by the sitting Attorney General's own department. It is not a claim that no irregularities existed anywhere in the country.
That same distinction, process integrity versus a blanket guarantee, is how I'd characterize the ODNI's finding too. The intelligence community's assessment states it had no indications that a foreign actor attempted to alter voter registration, ballot casting, tabulation, or result reporting in 2020. That's a technical process judgment about the machinery of the election, and on its own terms, it's a strong one. But the same assessment includes a minority view that China took limited steps to undermine Trump's re-election prospects. The finished product didn't land on full analytic consensus. That matters for what comes next. The clean, technical process finding applies to one election cycle. Every later cycle requires fresh scrutiny, and the recorded disagreement gives us another reason to keep institutional trust open to review. I need a direct answer from each of you for the audience. Based on this record, do these documents, combined with what we've just discussed, prove the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, yes or no?
No. A stolen election claim requires outcome-changing fraud that got past mail ballot controls, a hand audit run by the opposing party in Georgia, a Republican-led legislative investigation in Michigan, and DOJ leadership, all without leaving a trace any of them could find. That's not what this record shows.
No, what we have is a Georgia audit confirming an accurate count in one state, a Michigan committee finding no evidence of widespread fraud, and two court opinions rejecting insufficient proof of the relief being sought. None of that, individually or together, adds up to fraud at outcome-changing scale. The claim doesn't survive being checked against its own sources.
No. On the historical question, I agree with both of them. The ODNI's technical process finding stands, and I'm not going to pretend the minority view inside that same document proves otherwise. But that finding answers a 2020 question. Institutional trust and security have to be reassessed for every election that follows. And honestly, I don't think the three of us are aligned on how much confidence the 2020 record should buy us next time. We're back for our final segment. We've gone through the Michigan investigation, the non-citizen registration claims, and the intelligence documents on Chinese operations. The White House has framed this release as proof of systemic corruption and a suppressed truth. I want us to do something harder than debunking it. Stan, give us the strongest, good faith version of their case, not the headline version, the version built only from what's actually in these documents.
Start with the registration drive. The original Muskegon referral describes applications with non-existent addresses, invalid phone numbers, mismatched signatures, and handwriting that repeats across supposedly different applicants. Field agents flagged those facts in October 2020. The follow-up casework is worse. Of 107 sampled applications, 91 returned no match in the state database at all. And among the 16 that did match a real person, only 4 had signatures that corresponded. The primary case memo confirms those figures. Witnesses independently described being paid by the registration, being told to invent information, and watching forged signatures get produced on the spot. This is documented misconduct inside a registration drive. Then look at what happened to the case. It stayed active over 4 years. Agents wrote that they didn't want to close it. Federal and state authorities ultimately declined it. The public file does not explain why that evidence ended in declination rather than charges.
The unexplained decision deserves scrutiny without being inflated into proof of a larger
I'll take the vulnerability half of the Steelman because it's real and I don't want to undersell it. The intelligence community's own assessment says named adversaries had the capability to compromise election infrastructure, and it specifically flags registration databases, poll books, and election websites as exposed. CISA and the AAC separately issued a coordinated advisory on real vulnerabilities in a widely used ballot marking component. There's also a long-standing intelligence concern about adversary intent more broadly. A declassified CIA note describes years of reporting on interest in, and possible methods for, manipulating voting machines abroad. Though the note carries its own caveats and doesn't establish large-scale electronic fraud even in the elections it examines, let alone anything here. None of that is manufactured. Where the Steelman has to stop is at exploitation. That same assessment says operations against tabulation and reporting would probably create delay and confusion without probably changing certified results. On Michigan, Stan's right that the declinations are unexplained in this record. We don't have the prosecutorial reasoning, so we can't rule out either an ordinary evidentiary judgment or something worse. What I won't do is fold in the Southfield story as proof the Muskegon Drive reached a counted ballot. A woman told the FBI she declined an in-person registration attempt, later received a registration card and what she believed was an absentee ballot, and destroyed it herself. That's disturbing on its own. But the record doesn't say who submitted that registration or tie it to the Muskegon operation specifically. And Michigan officials who reviewed the broader case told reporters they didn't find a completed, counted fraudulent vote. Treating that one household as the missing link to the larger drive isn't in the documents. It's an inference we'd be at.
The intelligent Steelman begins with the PRC possessing and analyzing large volumes of American voter-related data, including a set one memo lists at over 204 million records. Then comes the internal dispute. An official wrote that a pending presidential daily brief item was being reworked to avoid drawing a direct line to the election. The final assessment's minority view held that Beijing took limited steps to undermine Trump's re-election prospects. And the Albany report alleged a specific Chinese-linked scheme involving fraudulent documents and mail ballots. Its recall notice called for re-interviewing the source. Later records say the source supplied additional context, yet headquarters did not reissue the report. That sequence deserves an explanation. It still does not supply the missing proof. No released record ties the PRC data holdings to a fraudulent registration, an issued ballot, a cast ballot, or an altered count, and the ODNI assessment found no indication of foreign actor altered registration, casting, tabulation, or reporting in 2020.
which is the honest boundary of the case. I can argue institutional failure and unexplained decisions with a straight face. I can't argue from what's public that any of this reached a counted vote, and I'm not going to pretend the documents get me there.
The constructive response is to release the records that could answer the remaining questions. Citizenship matching estimates should arrive with their methodology and false positive rate. Oversight committees need a redacted account of why referred fraud cases are declined. A recalled intelligence report should carry its current corroboration status, and declassified PDB disputes should include the actual draft-to-draft changes. Claims about foreign acquisition of American data also need an acquisition and attribution basis, not just a startling volume. The responsibility follows the claim. Election officials must make matching methods testable. Prosecutors must account to oversight for declinations, and the FBI and intelligence community must publish enough of the recall, drafting, and attribution records to show their work.
Then make testability the rule. Any institution asking the public to trust a number, a declination, a recall, or an attribution should release the method and record needed to evaluate it. Until that happens, both certainty and suspicion outrun the available evidence.
I agree on the records. I don't agree with Stan's instinct that the 2020 institutional checks should buy the public broad confidence going forward. They answer a historical outcome question. They do not erase the exposure these files document.
And I don't agree that permanent suspicion is a security policy.
Confidence has to remain conditional and auditable, but it also has to respond when audits and evidence answer the question put to them. Otherwise, no result can ever close.
Then that is the unresolved line. Build systems that can earn confidence repeatedly and publish enough evidence that neither trust nor suspicion has to operate on faith.
Then here are the calibrated verdicts. The vulnerability files establish serious weaknesses across registration systems and voting components, along with long-standing concern about adversary capability. They never show exploitation at a scale that altered the 2020 outcome. The China archive is stronger on counterintelligence. PRC acquisition and analysis touched American voter information at scale, and officials genuinely disagreed about its significance. The missing bridge is from that data to a fraudulent registration, ballot, or altered total. Michigan is the clearest domestic misconduct in the release. The files document substantial evidence of likely fabricated registration applications and a review process that ended in declination for reasons that are still not fully public. They stop short of a counted fraudulent vote, which Michigan officials say they did not find. The intelligence handling record is similarly incomplete. A disputed PDB framing decision, a recalled report, a stated reason for the recall, and internal evidence that complicates that reason. That supports scrutiny of the process. It cannot carry the larger claim that officials coordinated to bury proof of a stolen election. Finally, the administration's approximately 278,000 non-citizen estimate cannot be reproduced from the released material. A federal court also found serious defects in a related matching tool, including citizens wrongly flagged. Until the method and validation are public, that number remains an administration claim awaiting proof.
So hold both things at once. These documents surface real problems: misconduct in a registration drive, a serious foreign data and influence capability, and genuine internal disagreement about how to characterize threats. They don't surface proof that the 2020 election was stolen. And an independent review of the same release reached the same conclusion. Contemporary Justice Department leadership likewise reported no fraud on a scale that could have changed the 2020 outcome. That's what they prove and what they